the banking regulators are trying to either clean up or prevent a different kind of mess, another bank crisis, and they actually made some steps this week to do that by saying to banks, you either have to be more conservative or get smaller.
Right.
By saying, got to have more capital.
Yeah, so, if Dodd-Frank sort of set up the architecture for how government could take down a failing institution, they left a lot of the details up in the air.
Yeah.
And over the last couple of years, we've seen growing concern that big banks are still too much of a risk to the financial system, that if you had a JP Morgan get into trouble, you would have to have some kind of taxpayer rescue. So now what they're trying to do is force banks to shrink voluntarily. They don't want to go as far as some in Congress have suggested, and even some Federal Reserve officials have suggested, to go as far as breaking up the banks, but they want to make it hard to be big. So this week we saw them increasing something called a leverage ratio, which basically means these banks are going to have to hold bigger reservoirs of financing in case they get into trouble. So if you have a problem, you don't have a government rescue because you've got enough capital there to weather whatever kind of storm comes their way.
But why does that force them to shrink, though?
Well, it doesn't. It's a calculation for some banks. I mean, they basically are just saying, if you want to be big, you're going to have enough capital to hold it. And so they sort of are saying to them, you can decide whether it's worth it to you to be as big as you are now. You're going to have to do things potentially like cut back on dividends, cut back on the types of debt you have, and so it's going to make it more onerous to be big. And for some banks, that trade-off's just not there.
The way I think of it, it's a tax on being very big. So if you're big because you can make a lot of money being big, you're willing to pay the tax. But if you're big only because you're too big to fail and people will lend you money because they figure the government will bail you out, then the tax may not be worth paying, and that's kind of the calculation.
Right.
But this is the banks obviously don't like this, right? They wouldn't. But is it a partisan issue? I mean, this strikes me as one of those where it's hard to know where the partisan lines are. Almost every issue in Washington now is partisan and divisive as a result. I'm not sure this one really is it?
No, I mean, this is a case where you see Elizabeth Warren and Bob Corker agreeing. I mean, they both want the banks to get smaller. There are divisions about how to do that. Some want, a much more prescriptive approach, but you've got the Brown-Vitter bill where they're basically in agreement too that the banks need to hold much higher levels of capital. That said, I don't think that you're ever going to see that kind of legislation move unless there is another big financial crisis or another big London whale.
I think there's a kind of populism on the left and populism on the right that is suspicious of big finance. That's a long tradition of that in U.S. politics. And in this case, you're seeing that play again. And I think the surprise to many of the critics is that the Fed and the other bank regulators actually did this because they had pretty much given up hope.
Right. I mean, there seems to have been some sort of sea change. It may have been the London whale. It may have been all this political pressure. You get Liz Warren, questioning Ben Bernanke is too big to fail over. What are you doing to make sure it's over? There seems to have been in the last few months kind of a realization that, we need to do more. So what they did this week was just one step. There's a lot of other things that they have in the pipeline, more fees, bigger capital cushions, other things that they're going to impose on these banks. And like David said, the Fed kind of is posing it as like a franchise fee. If you want to be big, you've got to pay.
Yeah, and it is interesting. The financial crisis began, 5-6 years ago. We're still trying to figure out how do you prevent the next one, and we're not really there yet.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is giving a lot of people pause, is that when you see something like the London whale, you realize that there is still vulnerability in the financial system, and how do we get to a point where, even if, there will eventually be another financial crisis, so how do we get to the point where we don't need a government bailout? As much as people say there won't be one, there would be if a bank like Citigroup or Bank of America got into trouble.